We're going to start, and I'm going to say a really warm welcome. Thank you very much indeed for everyone here for joining us this morning at our virtual breakfast. And I'm well aware there are people from, well, as just pointed out, all over the country. I know there's others as well who are joining, as well as people locally. We're saying this is Linton Free Church men's breakfast. But it's a sort of nonsense, all of that, isn't it? Because first of all, actually, there's lots of people from various places joining us. You're all very, very welcome. Secondly, it's a men's breakfast, and there's about an equal number of men and women here, and you're all very welcome. And secondly, I've got breakfast, and thirdly, I've got breakfast for you. So apart from that, the title makes sense. But we're living in the times that we do, and it's good to be able to gather, perhaps share breakfasts, even if not together literally, but at least virtually like that. And I guess that's part of what we're doing. And in these strange times, we adapt and we do what we can. But one thing that we try and do in these gatherings, and we're trying to replicate here, and hope that people will enjoy and appreciate, is to have someone come along and share some thoughts with us about something to do with their life, their faith. Actually, our theme is my work, my life, my faith, which allows anyone just to reflect in any of that sort of territory and share some thoughts pretty openly, and for us to sort of engage and think through, ask questions together as we all think through our situations, perhaps our work, things in life, things in society, and how does faith work with that? Sometimes that's quite a tough question. Often it's very encouraging to hear how people are working through that, and it's sort of encouraging each other and thinking through honestly, how do we make sense of our world and faith and God and the role of Jesus and centrality of Jesus to all walks of life. And again, that's what we're going to do this morning. Roger's kindly joined. Roger has been to, numbers of you will know, men's breakfast previously with us, when we used to do it in that old-fashioned way of gathering together and sitting around and eating food in a room. And we were grateful to him for doing that. He's particularly agreed to, well, when I wrote it down, he didn't say no, join us on the topic of Breakfast with a Christian Medic, Reflections on Faith and the Current Pandemic, which is really, really good of Roger to do, because there's a topic. But that's what Roger's going to try and do with us from there. So here's how it's going to work. Roger's not going to give a talk as such. He's going to respond to questions. We'll start off, Roger and I, with just a couple of general questions from me. And then, as I've said, there's the opportunity to use the chat function, which is on Zoom, which will allow you to ask questions, offer comments as appropriate, and we'll try and feed that through. I'll look at that, perhaps paraphrase that back through to Roger, or Roger might pick up on some of those directly. So big thanks to Dan Gilbert for enabling and hosting the whole meeting and allowing all the technicals to happen in that. I've said several times, the very, very latest we'll finish is at 10. We'll try and get through a bit before 10 o'clock and hope that gives plenty of opportunity to think through things properly, but also for people to get on in the day and all the rest of it. So, Roger, really big thanks to you for doing this. I think I'm going to say you're brave, because this is a big topic to take on. And let's be honest, we need to be honest, it's something that all of us have been probably thinking a lot about, praying about, reflecting on a lot about. How does faith work? What are we thinking in this pandemic? So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to ask you just a very general first question, and that is, please do tell us a little bit about yourself. Perhaps you might tell us what we think we should know about you. It's up to you. Just give us a little bit of your background, Roger, okay. And then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, thanks, Steve. Yes, I mean, I have a sort of a split job, if you like. I currently work at Addenbrookes Hospital as a consultant neurologist, and that's dealing with people with neurological problems, typically Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. and general neurology. And then the other half of my life is spent doing research, which is primarily around, which I think I've spoken before at the men's breakfast about, repairing the brain with genes and cell therapies and things of that nature. And in the context of the pandemic, my normal role is that I mainly do outpatient work. So see people in the clinic. I do some work in the hospital, mainly just covering on call. When the pandemic struck in March, we had to all change our jobs. So the hospital was very much ahead of the curve. But my role when the pandemic came was that I, with several colleagues, volunteered to be part of a more active neurology team. All of our junior staff were taken away to look after the COVID patients, which meant that I then had to cover casualty, or not allowed to call it casualty, they've changed the name, which caused great upset to everyone in casualty when I kept calling it casualty. It's called the emergency department. So I took over the role of the junior neurologist in the emergency department. So I was there for 24-hour shifts, allowed home from 10 till 10. No, we're allowed to leave at 10, come back at 8 in the morning, dealing with all the acute strokes and neurology coming in through the emergency department, which was not something I had done in 25 years. So that was my role in the pandemic, did that for 3 months. And obviously, as all of you are aware, that we've now moved to another stage where that is unlikely to happen again in the hospital because they're desperate to keep everything going as they can. So I'm actually an academic neurologist, but we all had to sort of get on and do more general neurology in the context of the pandemic, which obviously exposed me to aspects of the pandemic, which we can discuss and explore really, because I think they were interesting. There were positives that came out of it, I would say. So definitely positives, but there were also a lot of negatives, I thought.
Okay, no, thanks for that, Roger. And it's good and important to know that background. And as a wider background, you happen to have quite a few connections with various people on this meeting and in the church as well, don't you? So people know you in a range of different ways. But it's really helpful to have your sort of professional and medical background, particularly perhaps interesting to hear very recently in your very, very direct role and involvement with some of the impacts of the pandemic. So I guess deliberately what I want to do is ask you this question, which I think really gets us going. And, you're clearly a medic, a very experienced medic, and operated in numbers of pretty extraordinary ways at times. And absolutely, you're a Christian and you confess to be a Christian and a follower of Jesus. So with all of that and with what you've seen, how do you reflect on the pandemic that we find ourselves in from your Christian standpoint, from your standpoint as an expert medic, from your direct involvement? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you reflecting, given who you are and what you've seen?
Yeah, so I'll probably do it in answer that in a number of ways, Steve. I think the first thing was, coming back to what I was saying, what were the positives that came out of this? So obviously people look at it and say, what on earth could be positive about this pandemic, given the disruption it's caused and the distress and upset to people? Well, certainly within the hospital, one of the positive sides of it was it made it much more of a team. So, Addenbrookes Hospital, I think, employs 8,000 people or something across the biomedical campus. You don't know most of them. So it really brought together a sense of team. And I thought that was a terribly positive thing. And it made me much more aware of what the junior staff have to put up with every day, which made me much more empathic for that. I think the real downside of it was, the first was the trauma of people being this ill, although I didn't see that many COVID cases because they obviously went to the relevant doctors rather than neurologists, but we did see few because COVID increases your risk of stroke, so we saw strokes with it. And part of the problem there, I think, was the sadness of people being on their own. So as you know, you could not come in with relatives. So it was very difficult to assess people because they had no one to give you a story. And secondly, these were people admitted with extreme illness on their own into hospital with no one with them. So that was a huge, huge sadness on the loneliness that people can live with their life. And then on a sort of, I suppose on a bigger scale, I think there were sort of three things that have struck me about the pandemic, which is sort of reflecting what people think really. I think all of which I think have medical answers and all of which I think have an impact on one's Christian belief. So I think, first of all, people feel that COVID strikes at random. So part of the reason people have got so anxious and scared about all of this I think there are three reasons. One is it seems to strike randomly, so people just get it. Some people do relatively well with it. Some people do very badly. So it looks as though this is random. Secondly, people can't believe that it's incurable. This is incurable. You know, if you get it and you do badly, you can't be cured of it. There's no treatment for it. There's only supportive therapies. And thirdly, people die. And people are dying in quite large numbers. So I think those three reasons make people extremely anxious that they could get it. They could come extremely unwell. The doctors can't save me and I'll die. Now, whilst all of that is true, actually, that is true of medicine. I mean, why do some people get Parkinson's disease? Why do some people get stomach cancer? Why do some people get heart attacks? There are obviously medical reasons for it. So I think the idea that things strike at random seems to be true, but there are reasons for that. And I'll come back to that, I think, from a sort of Christian perspective. I think, secondly, this idea that things are incurable is not new in medicine. I mean, most things we have are incurable. Parkinson's disease is incurable. Diseases, dementia is incurable. So the idea that we have incurable diseases is also not new. And thirdly, people dying is something we've rather neglected in the 21st century. So if this pandemic had struck 100 years ago, as the Spanish flu did, everyone would know someone in their family that had died young. This was not a taboo subject. You know, sexually transmitted diseases, things of that nature were taboo subjects 100 years ago. Nowadays, death is seen, I think, as a sort of failure of medical therapy rather than the natural consequence of life. And I think, you know, one of the things with the pandemic was people would cite, 800 people have died today of COVID, 600 people have died of COVID. People get very worked up about those figures, but, most people know that 1,000 people die every day of stroke and heart attack. That's what happens in the UK. So people are dying in large numbers from other diseases. So I think, all of these anxieties, which are very real and very natural, are not unique. And then I think it throws out a bigger question, which of course is what you reflect on, I think, as a Christian is, apart from the immediate, I think, response as a Christian to help, try and console people, do what you can to try and help, it raises questions about how you view the world. So how much do you think, for example, going through those things, that God is really in charge? Because if you think the disease strikes at random, then that would imply that most things in the world happen by random, which means that there is no control of that world. So everything that happens is completely random. Well, how can you say that God is in charge if it just happens randomly? You might not understand it. So my view is, you might not understand these things from your perspective, but these things are not random to God. This is how it happens. So then the second one is, things are incurable. Well, life is incurable. I mean, we were created, we are fallen, we will die. So disease and dying is a consequence of a fallen world and the biological system that we are. So actually, that's perfectly normal to think in that way. And then the third thing, which I suppose was the thing I reflected on most, was dying. So what should be your view as a Christian to dying? Because we will all, in church, in our own private time, think about, the greater kingdom to come, being with Jesus in the new creation. And yet when we're offered that, in the sense that we're going to die, we're sort of not so keen on it, really. And so I think, what is our view on dying? So I think for me, and obviously in my own personal life, things have happened in my life where we have lost people very close to us at times, unexpected. So they have died and gone in events which seem to be random. And so it brought back all those sort of thoughts about God is in charge and you have to trust God, even if you don't understand it. And how much do you fear death and how much do you actually accept that death is inevitable and accept that will happen? And if it happens now, so be it. That's not to say one should be reckless in terms of, COVID, but I think it gets you to reflect on these bigger questions, really. And I think for people who are not Christians at work, obviously, if you don't have that perspective, it is even more frightening because it does look as though it's random and this will be the end. And that's that. So, and I think that's why I suspect there is a lot of anxiety in society. I think it's changed a bit now with the second, because I think people have moved more to being frustrated about the restrictions as much more than the actual disease. But those were certainly my reflections early on about how the pandemic was playing out in hospital life, doctors' lives, patients' lives, and the public.
Thanks, Roger. You know, that's really interesting. It's very good of you to be so open and reflective, and clearly, you know, you've thought deeply about that, and you said some interesting, some pretty challenging things. And maybe some might feel some reassuring things there. Thank you, and I know people are going to be interested just to reflect on that with you. I can see there's one question come up in the chat, so can I just encourage people to be thinking, look, is there a question you want to put to Roger? Is there an observation? Is there a comment at all? Please do start doing that. I suppose a question that I hear quite a lot, Roger, just sort of leading in through all of that you perhaps touched on insofar as you and yourself, and people say, where's God in this pandemic? Where is he? You know, what's going, sort of a little bit about what's going on here. This is the randomness, isn't it? What's happening? This is bad. Where's God? Where is he?
I think this is always the challenge, and this is always the difficulty, I would say, when disaster strikes. So I remember this very clearly when that awful tsunami struck at the early part of this century, and all of those people, you know, hundreds of thousands of people died. And Rowan Williams was asked, I think, about where was God in all of this. And you know, from a human perspective, sitting on where we are now, it's very hard to see why God would allow this to happen. What positive things could happen out of this? And I suppose you just have to trust God to say, well, this is a fallen world, and he doesn't, you know, things happen and things are allowed to happen. And that is the way it is. And I think what you can see in it is you can obviously see Christians working in it. So I think one of the most amazing things about this pandemic is the generosity and the selflessness of people. So the people sacrificing time, money, sometimes their lives to help others. So this is a wonderful show of human love from God, which he's shown to us through Jesus, that we show to others through how we're working. So I think there are the little things. I think the bigger picture, I couldn't say I understand why God allows this to happen. One of the comforts I've always taken is that, you know, it's a bit like coming back to this question about dying. You know, you sort of think, well, we're living through this awful time. People are dying. But if you truly believe that you will inherit an eternal life, then, you know, a 2-week lockdown, a 3-month lockdown, a couple of years, dying a few years early, I mean, they're rather trivial timescales against an eternity, really. So, but we don't think like that. We're always thinking, you know, I've got to have everything by Monday. I've got to have everything by next weekend. I've got to do this by the end of the year. So I think trying to look at it on a bigger perspective can be helpful, I think. But it's very difficult, because if you don't believe, I mean, what's interesting is people don't believe, and then they say, where's God in all this? And you think, well, if you don't believe, why are you even asking that question? And I think it's very easy to be very trite about it. And I think we have to, you know, there are so many things I don't understand. If I'm honest, I can't get my head around the Trinity. I believe in it, but what it is, I find that very difficult. But then I can't explain why the universe is expanding into nothing. That I don't understand. So you just have to, that from a human perspective in your own mind, you cannot understand and explain everything.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you for those reflections. Thank you also for teeing up the next 2 breakfasts you're going to have with us, which is about the Trinity and how the world's heading into nothing. So anyway, we'll stick to where we are right now. We're getting some things coming through on the chat, so thank you for that. I'm going to perhaps pick up on the first couple and see what you think, and then we'll work our way through that. So we've got a question that says, you know, how did you have to rely on your faith when suddenly you found yourself back in the emergency department, if we're calling that the right thing now, with hands-on care? And also, perhaps with all of that, did you have any opportunity to share your faith during a pandemic, perhaps with patients, colleagues? You know, was that plausible? Was that easy? Was that really difficult? Was that not appropriate? So, you know, how have you relied on your faith in quite a real practical way in some of this? And also, what about sharing your faith in any way with it?
Yeah, well, I always told the patients to pray before I did anything. I mean, they are stressful situations, and my entire medical career, I mean, medicine's changed nowadays, but when I qualified in the 1980s, you were very much exposed to learning by experience, is what they used to call it, which was that you were just left to get on with it, basically. And so you do have to rely on God helping you through that and supporting you through that. You have a confidence in that God will protect you, and he puts people around you to protect you. So I'm very blessed that I have a wonderful wife who supports me in a very real way when dealing with the stresses of all of this, which of course you don't tend to exhibit at work because it doesn't help the patient if you're looking very anxious yourself. So, you know, God equips you to deal with things which you didn't think you would be able to cope with. So I think if someone suddenly said, well, tomorrow, you know, in an hour's time, Roger, you'll be dumped in the emergency department and you'll be there all day, you get incredibly anxious about it. But actually, when you get there, you realize that God has provided for you in terms of helping you, and providing people around you can help support you. In terms of sharing faith, this I've always found quite difficult. So actually, when I was more junior, I found it much easier to share my faith with people at work. But I've become a bit, this may be a sign of weakness, really. I've become less active in that way for fear that it might cause upset and be seen to be not what you should be doing in a professional role of leadership. But one of the things I think one did share was some of the questions I was asking. You know, why are you frightened about this? Why do people fear death so much? What is it about death? And so whilst not directly talking about one faith, one tried to get people to think a bit bigger about the fragility of life, and is there more to it than just simply coming to work every day and doing what we do? So it's more getting people to reflect on it, I would say, than necessarily sort of talking about one faith. I mean, I'm very blessed because in my department, for example, we have a number of very devout Christians. So actually within our department, and we meet every Wednesday, not just in our department, but in the hospital, we have a group that meets on a Wednesday morning. So one does have support there, and also then share it in a wider community through that.
Thank you. There's some other questions, comments coming through. Thanks for those. Do keep feeding those through. So there's a question here coming through about what do you see as the actual causes of the pandemics? For example, the issue of the wet markets in China, and some of perhaps the issues about that. And perhaps a bigger question, therefore, which interrelates with some of the things being reflected on, is do you see this pandemic as a human-created disease, or you know, where's this come from? And seeing that through both your medical eyes, but obviously your faith eyes as well. Where's this come from? And then perhaps another quite practical question. You've probably been tested for COVID-19 quite a lot of times. Do you know if you've had it? And anyway, there's a couple of questions.
Well, I'll take the last question first. So I haven't been tested lots of times. I mean, you have to remember how the testing actually works. So one of the problems at the beginning was you could not get tested. So when it started, of course, you couldn't get tested unless you were admitted to hospital with features consistent with COVID. So when it began, the only people who ever got tested, which is why the numbers now are so meaningless on the positive cases now versus what it was earlier in the year. So we could not get tested ourselves to begin with unless we actually felt we were going to be admitted to hospital with symptoms. So of course, that was one of the big problems when it began, was people were self-isolating with a bit of a cold and couldn't be certain they hadn't got COVID. I have had a test because they were looking for asymptomatic, how many members of staff were asymptomatic, and it was negative. And I had a blood test in June where I had not been exposed to it. I had not got any antibody response to it. You know, just for people, the reassurance at the moment in this part of the world, it's not that great. So as of yesterday, Addenbrookes Hospital had 5 patients with COVID, 1 on ITU, 4 on the inpatient wards. In April, it was about 150. and 50 were in ITU. I don't know what Papworth's like because it's a different trust. In terms of whether this is man-made, I think these infections coming from one animal jumping across from one species to another is not that unusual. It's not my field of expertise, so all of this is just my reading of it. So I think this is not unusual. I think for and we've seen it before with different coronaviruses. I think what's been very revealing about this pandemic is, first of all, how much we have accepted traveling in the way that we do. So if this had happened 100 years ago in Wuhan, it would not be causing the mayhem I think it does now, because the speed with which it can spread because of the transport networks is obviously very different. And I think that raises questions about how much we've all been complicit, including me very heavily, in just accepting traveling around the world as something we are entitled to do and should be doing and can be doing, and all of the problems that brings with it in terms of pollution, but also in terms of the spread of disease. I think it's also revealed a vacuum of leadership and complacency within our society about the risk of these infections. So I think, coming back to something I was saying earlier about the fact that we think, we don't really think about death. We think pandemics and bugs are things of the Victorian age or the early 20th century. They're not something we need to worry about now. But this just reveals that these pandemics are likely to happen. People have predicted that they would happen, and we have not been prepared for it. So, in the UK, a lot of our public health and people in charge of that has been devolved to local government over the last 10 years. Local governments obviously have been squeezed in terms of money. They would prefer to keep the library open than invest in public health. Public health has therefore gone down the agenda. This strikes and suddenly we are exposed. So I think we are complicit in it, in the sense, I don't think it's man-made, in the sense I think this is a natural part, this is part of the natural world. But I think the speed and the virulence of it has been driven by man-made factors.
Okay. Thank you. Really interesting. A lot for us to think about as society, as people, and absolutely as Christians in all of this. There's a specific question here for you when it's to do with us from a clinical point of view. You as a medic, that facing a potential second wave that clearly seems to be here and has developed. Do you think it's better for seriously ill patients, and would they be helped by having close family members being able to in some way be properly present with them, as opposed to the way things seem to be handled first time round, where zero contact and complete banning was the way with that? Have you got a judgment or thought about that from your perspective?
I think it was I can understand the decision. And of course, it's easy in retrospect to say, well, you should have allowed people in. But at the time, we didn't have enough testing. There was a worry that this would just spread everywhere. And the real worry is it spreads within the hospital. And if it started spreading within the staff. So the real worry at the beginning, and I will answer this question, was that not only would the number of patients increase and go up, but the number of medical people there to deal with them would go down. So we would tip past a critical point. And therefore people would be coming to hospital and simply couldn't be treated. And that was the real anxiety, that, if you're 98 and you've got 6 major medical problems, it would not be surprising if you succumb to it, but you wouldn't want to be 55, perfectly fit and well, turn up at hospital with it and say, I'm sorry, Steve, we've got no ITU beds, you're on your own, mate, and we've got no staff ready to look after you. And that was the real worry. I think it was a mistake. And it's often the little things which I think are very difficult. So I think anyone coming into, I always remember one patient I looked after who died, who came in with a stroke. We treated him. He then had a complication from the treatment and then he died. And, when he left his house with his stroke, his wife would have seen him go into the ambulance. And then the last time she'd have seen him was then she managed to just come in just before he died. But you sort of think, those last few days of a life they've lived together, separated in that way, seemed to me terribly cruel. And actually, given that there is a risk with having a relative there. I think the risk was less than the harm it caused, both to him in his last few days, but for her, who will have to live with that now for the rest of her days. So I think that was a mistake, and I think we have to have, be more humane in this and accept that we should allow people to be with people in their last few days. It's not that the hospital staff were not kind, but of course, they don't know them from Adam. They don't know who this person is, and so I think that was a sadness. And the other just sort of related issue is one of the difficulties with all of this is communicating with people. So if I try and be empathic whilst wearing a mask, it's extremely difficult. You actually fail to realise how much you give away in terms of your relationship to people through your mouth, through your face. And when, especially when you're in full PPE, you've got goggles on, you've got a visor, a mask, a hat and everything, it doesn't have the same. So I think, and I don't think we can get around that, but I do think trying to be kinder to people and allowing people in with them, with the people who are seriously ill despite COVID, should be taken into account. And I don't know, that may be happening now. I mean, I think we have learnt lessons from it, but I do think that was probably a wrong thing to do.
Thank you, and thanks for your honesty and real reflection on that. And I'm sure that's a really clear answer to that question that was asked there. We sort of now, so we've got a little bit of a follow-up question popped through, Roger, from Rachel Newton. Welcome, Rachel, delighted you're joining us, and many people in the church will know Rachel, and Mark and Jan, of course, regular attenders of the church, still living in Linton. Rachel says, I'm a paediatric speech and language therapist, and the whole issues with wearing masks, visors, etc., of work in the communities made me think a lot about communication, the impact of communication, just what you were talking about there, Roger, and the mask wearing in the community. Wondering, what do you think about this? What's your perspective as a Christian Scientist medic on how important it is to wear masks, but also some of the issues clearly that you're identifying? Rachel's reflected on a lot. What do you think about that? There's much debated, and we don't have to get drawn into US presidential debates in such thing. Probably a very good idea not to, but what are you thinking about masks?
Well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because if you actually follow the government's guidance on masks over this year, it would have gone absolutely everywhere. So one of the things we were told definitely not to bother doing in the early part was to wear masks, and now it's the great mantra. I think there is no doubt that if you wear a mask, it will reduce the risk of spread. And I think, a bit like Jesus saying about, give to Caesar what you owe to Caesar in taxes, you should do what people tell you to do. So you should be wearing masks in places where there is a risk that you could pass it to others. So I think it's perfectly, you should be wearing masks in crowded areas. You should be wearing it on public transport and in shops and things like that. Now I personally don't wear masks when I'm walking around, because the risk of it being transmitted to someone when you're just walking down the street is minimal. I think then the more tricky question is what do you do when you're communicating with people? And Rachel's perspective, I mean, speech and language therapy, when you can't see someone's mouth and you can't hear them clearly. So that's the other problem. People's hearing isn't great and you're talking through a mask. So I think you just have to apply common sense, is my own view on this. So I think you should follow the rules as best you can. I think one of the problems is the rules are often not very logical, and that personally I always struggle with. If I can't understand the reason why you're doing it, then why are you doing it? And if someone can't explain it, it makes it a bit harder. But I do think you have to, so when I do see patients in clinic, I wear a mask, but part of my examination involves looking at their throat and their tongue and things like that. So I have to get them to take their mask off. So we just have to accept there is a small risk when I do that. But I think, and what would I do if I was telling someone some bad news? I probably would take my mask off. I mean, I would keep a distance, because the probability, I don't know that I've got it and asymptomatic, I don't know where they've got it, but actually I would prefer to take that risk to tell someone so they can actually see what I was thinking and trying to express than keep a mask on just to obey some rule, which would seem to not apply very easily in that situation.
Thank you. And, a real practical, significant question. One of the many things, and thanks for that question, Rachel, for reflecting. And, we remember you and pray for you in your work, Rachel, with all you're doing. Thank you for that. So you always knew, Roger, that having your friend Alex on this was going to be a double-edged sword. So he doesn't want one question, he wants two. And you can guess that we could now spend the next 3 hours on this. So here's a couple of questions, and you've got 5 minutes to answer.
I'm not sure even I understand the second question.
But... No, well, I think I'm going to guess I'll try and remember what it means. So one question is, do you think other nations basically have dealt with this better? Have we got better systems in place or whatever else that might have done better and we could therefore have learned from? And then what about, the suggestion that some Christians might be having with this, as perhaps with other events of this sort, there could be eschatological implications, which I think means end times, that it's building up with some of the understanding towards that. Although Alex would probably say I've got that completely wrong and you might know better, Roger. So have other countries done this better, or could we learn? And secondly, are there sort of, Alex is going to have to correct us, end time implications? Does it mean that we're heading for something we can see some things, perhaps some of the things, depending on how you interpret Revelation? Alex, this, what are you leading us into here? But anyway, that's that type of stuff, I suppose. Over to you, Roger.
So I think other nations have done it better than us. And the question will be, why have they done it better than us? I think one of the problems with all of this is trying to weigh up the science versus the politics. And obviously it's easy to have a very clear scientific perspective on this without taking into account the economy. So if I simply take into account how I would treat this medically, that may have dire economic consequences for the country, which it has done, and it may continue to do so. But I think one of the problems has been that countries like Germany have been very efficient about this because, there was complacency, I think, in this country that we didn't plan for it, which is not unique to the UK. So, America did the same. So lots of countries have, coming back to what I said earlier, have been complacent about this risk. But we didn't learn as things were evolving in China and then in Italy, and we didn't prepare. We didn't devolve in the way. So Paul Nurse, who's the president of the Royal Society, won the Nobel Prize for finding genes to do with cancer, was very keen that we should have taken a Dunkirk approach to begin with, which was that testing should be done at all locally in all the labs that could do this type of test, rather than devolve to some major central organisation that would do it. So I think this reliance on central government and central contracts and central control has been a mistake, whereas Germany was much more distributed and therefore could offer a system which was much more efficient. And that, I think, has been our biggest failing and still is, that we do not have an efficient testing system with quick results, tracing people and locking people down as a result of that. And that has two consequences. One is, of course, the disease gets away from us, and secondly, people have no confidence in the system. So I read some letter yesterday where somebody had phoned in, having been said they'd got it, in a house. That house received 73 phone calls and text messages from the test and trace people about it, and none of the contacts were actually contacted. So the people who told them they had it were contacted 73 times, and the contacts who were at risk were not contacted at all. So that was just a failing of the system. So I think that's been a big failing of the system, and the capacity to plan. I think So I think Germany have kept a very close eye on it. I think they're the most successful, I would say. Obviously, China have been very successful, but that is a regime which allows them to basically lock down the cities. Now, Cambridge itself has actually done rather well, in part because they have slightly ignored the government and they have developed their own tests early on. So one of the reasons we could test people so efficiently in Cambridge was it was a homemade test where somebody built it in 3 or 4 weeks. So a lot of the testing done in Cambridge early on was totally home built. Now, whether this is the beginning of the end, if that is what the question is, I think is an interesting one. It takes me back to the days of AIDS, actually. So when I qualified in the mid-80s, AIDS was just appearing in the United Kingdom. So HIV, so they didn't even know it was HIV in those days. It was just this AIDS complex. And there was a belief when I was training in the mid to late 80s that this was going to overwhelm the population, and this was the beginning of a sort of judgment, if you like, the beginning of the end, that it was picking on particular groups in society, and that lots of people had perceived this as perhaps God's judgment and the wrapping up of this age. I mean, I didn't subscribe to that, and actually, that particular disease actually did develop a cure, and nowadays people with AIDS can live HIV can live a normal life. So I don't think that really. I think if you look back through history, then these pandemics are not unusual. I mean, people could be talking about the Spanish flu 100 years ago. We have flu every year, which comes in different virulent forms. So I don't think that this is unusual, would I say? I would say. So I don't think it has any implications in that sense. I mean, I think it has implications, as we've said, for how we live our lives and how we prioritise what we do, and how we see the world from a Christian perspective, and whether we've all deviated from what how we should be behaving in a way that perhaps we weren't aware of until this struck, really.
Thank you, and thanks for the questions, Alex, and thanks for the questions, everyone. And probably, we ought to be coming into land here a bit with our timings. But one thing that's powerfully striking me here, Roger, and I've really now remembered something you said that stuck with me, and I think stuck with others at a previous men's breakfast. And I think we were talking about some sort of genetic experimentation in that territory, and how you made sense of what you thought about as a Christian. And I remember you saying at one point, so, well, it is actually a bit tricky. So, but ultimately, I think this is what you said, your conclusion was, at least it's probably better having a Christian doing this stuff than having someone else doing it. And that was a really powerful statement, I thought, at the time. And actually, I think all of us are thinking this morning, thank goodness, thank God that you and indeed other good Christian people are involved in the front line here, and we recognise that, and whatever else, there's a bit of where is God. Well, I think we'd say, well, he's with you, and that's where God is, working in the midst of all that. So I think to you, and I know there's numbers of other medical practitioners on this morning who keyed in. I think it's right and proper that we say thank you. Thank you for what you've done. You've reflected on death, and he said, well, I just need to get stuck in there, and I guess you and other medical practitioners have no choice but to do that on behalf of others. And it seems to me it's a deeply Christian thing to do. And where is God? God is there with people like you. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for your presence and God's presence through you in dealing with all this, and actually reflecting like this with us, and helping us to understand and think and see that somehow this isn't a defeat for God, but God is in the middle of it, and it is part of the fallen world in which we live, but we trust in all things, and especially we can trust in death, and recognize and face up to that. So thank you. You're right. There's a question, isn't there, about what do we do? What can we do? But I guess what we can do is pray. Maybe you're right. I'll just say a quick prayer for you in a moment. If some of us are saying, what should we be praying? What would you say? What should we be praying in this, Roger?
I mean, I think, if I'm honest, I think we should pray for the wisdom for those who make the big decisions. So I think I think one of the things which I personally struggle with most is this issue about the medical scientific basis for how we should respond to the pandemic against the social economic consequences of it. So one of the, as you know, I mean, I feel particularly sorry for the younger people, because their education, both at school and university, has been decimated with this. Their job prospects when they leave either of those are currently not looking great, given how things are going. So I feel for that generation, whilst we've concentrated, I suppose, our attention understandably on the older generation because they're the ones most vulnerable to this illness, I think the long-term consequences of this will be felt more by younger people. So I think the wisdom for those in authority to know how best to manage all age groups and all aspects of society I don't want to get political about this, but I do think that there has been a bit of a vacuum around that, really. So I think praying for wisdom for those who make these decisions, and I think to give thanks for those who've actually done amazing things. I mean, my job is rather trivial compared to people in the hospital. There are people who have been on the front line dealing with these people who come through the front door, and especially in that early wave, they did not have PPE. They were there, they dealt with these people, and they've had to deal with, and not just in this part of the country, we've been very blessed here, really, in the way that we've managed. Other parts of the country overwhelmed with people having to deal with these difficult situations without appropriate care. So I think give thanks to all those who've actually done amazing things in the hospital and outside the hospital. So all of those key workers who have done so much. And then I think the third thing I pray for is trust, because none of us have really faced this. So I think the sort of bleakness, especially now, it was all right in some ways in March or April. Days are getting longer, the sun's out. It's all been a bit hard anyway for a few years at work. Be nice to take the foot off the accelerator. But now there's a sort of sense of, I think, anger and frustration and how much do I really have to listen to follow rules? So I think praying for patience for all of us to do what is right and to persevere, knowing that there's something better that we ultimately will inherit, I think it is a perspective that's terribly hard. We always look down rather than up, and I think trying to keep that longer term perspective is important. So those would be the sort of things I guess I pray for and would hope, and those are the sort of things I suppose which occupy my prayer time around the pandemic, really.
Thank you. That's really helpful, because I think that is something that many of us would ask and share amongst ourselves. So having those thoughts and pointers, and absolutely we'll want to remember that. I'm going to pick up a little bit and just briefly pray. That's all right. Pray for you, and then I think I promised you I might have found a little poem for you to sign off. So I hope you're going to enjoy that. So, but I'm just going to say a quick prayer and join in that people want as appropriate. But Lord, we thank you for Roger. We thank you for bringing him here to us this morning. Thank you for his wise words. Thank you for how you help him to understand and see the world. Thank you for his faith in you. And we pray that you'll continue to strengthen him and use him in his medical practice, in helping others like groups of us to understand and see things through your eyes. And we pray for him. We pray for other medical practitioners here joining us in this event this morning, and indeed all those working in healthcare, that you would be with them, you would help them, and you would help all of us to support and to value them. So thank you, and thank you for being with us, and please continue to support those all involved in the crucial healthcare work at the moment, and indeed at all times. And we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. And Roger, I thought I really ought to do a quick bit of reading before this, so I attempted to read and ended up reading rather quickly this book because I got behind, and I flicked through it. There's a lot of stuff in it, and very, very biblical. So God and the Pandemic by Tom Wright. But towards the end, I came across this and I thought, wow. And I think numbers of people here will be interested in this. So suddenly Tom Wright says, the poet Malcolm Guite has reflected brilliantly on this. Malcolm Guite, former Men's Breakfast. Do you remember? Maggie Guite, of course, is the rector of St Mary's Church in Linton, and we know Maggie well, and we enjoyed a men's breakfast not so very long ago when Malcolm himself came along, played his guitar, and indeed read us some poems, which was great. So here we have Tom Wright reflecting on the pandemic, and he says, actually, the poet Malcolm Guite has reflected on this, and he's written about this Easter 2020, with churches locked, and also reflecting on the recent British development at the time of people coming out of the houses on Thursday evening to applaud our courageous health workers. And Tom Wright says, I'm grateful to Malcolm for permission to quote the whole piece. So I'm going to read a poem by Malcolm Guite to us, who we know. And I just somehow particularly thought it was relevant to this morning, but it's also, I hope, relevant, particularly to health workers, someone like you, Roger. So this is Malcolm Guite, who's written a poem called Easter 2020. And where is Jesus this strange Easter day? Not lost in our locked churches, any more than he was sealed in that dark sepulchre. The locks are loosed, the stone is rolled away, and he is up and risen long before, alive, at large, and making his strong way into the world he gave his life to save. No need to seek him in his empty grave. He might have been a wafer in the hands of priests this day, or music from the lips of red-robed choristers. Instead, he slips away from church, takes off our linen bands to don his apron with a nurse. He grips and lifts a stretcher, soothes with gentle hands the frail flesh of the dying, gives them hope, breathes with the breathless, lends them strength to cope. On Thursdays, we applauded, for he came and served us in 1,000 names and faces, mopping our sickroom floors and catching traces of that corona which was death to him. Good Friday happened in 1,000 places where Jesus held the helpless, died with them, that they might share his Easter in their need. Now they are risen with him, risen indeed. And Tom Wright just goes on to say, part of the answer to the question, where is God in this pandemic, must be out there on the front line, suffering and dying to bring healing and hope. So anyway, I thought of you, Roger, when I read that, and you know, that's what Malcolm Guite's contributed for us this morning as well. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. Can I say a really big thank you to you, Roger? It's really, really good of you not only to give up your time, but to be open and in the way that you have. You know, these are not easy issues, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of us, but I'm certainly speaking personally. It's really encouraging, actually, to think, you know, faith is in the middle of this and not somehow shut out and it doesn't work. Yes, it does, and you know, you've helped us to see that. So thank you very much. I look forward to some of those next themes for men's breakfast that you've obviously got lined up for us. But anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks everyone. Thanks for those who gave comments and questions, but thanks very much for everyone for participating, and really hope you have a good rest of the day, whatever breakfast you did or didn't end up having. So and Chris Kempshaw says, join us tomorrow for church. Good point. So see many of you there, and everyone's welcome. Okay, all the best everyone. Many thanks for joining. See you.